The Science of the Scourge. This presentation will basically just illustrate the science that was explored through the novel, the biology of the exchange, chemical and biological warfare, and the social impacts that viruses can bring. So we'll start with the basic bio for the presentation because I'm going to go into the exchange, and understanding these terms will make it a lot easier for anyone watching this to wrap their head around. So first off, we'll talk about chromosomes. And chromosomes are thread-like structures containing DNA that code for genes within an organism. So our chromosome is this right here. And that just basically is your compacted version of something that controls traits of DNA. And we have 46 homologous pairs of chromosomes and 23 chromosomes. So those are our entire human genome, and all those chromosomes control all of our traits, our personalities, hair color, eye color, and skin color. So we then have alleles on these chromosomes, and so in biology we represent those with lines, and so each chromatid, which is one of these, each chromosome has two chromatids, has an allele for a certain trait on it, and our chromosome completes it. So we have two chromatids, two alleles. We usually have a dominant and recessive allele, but sometimes they show incomplete dominance, which we'll get into later. And so our two alleles determine one phenotype, which would be the color of your hair. So our biological term for alleles is possible alternative forms of genes that arise from mutation within the genetic code. So that would be like a light skin allele and a dark skin allele. Then we'll talk about mutations. Mutations are permanent alterations in the genome of an organism, which is why some humans have darker skin than others, or some humans have blue eyes while others have green eyes. It's all within the mutations that have occurred within DNA over the history of humanity, pretty much. And yeah, those occur on the alleles and DNA within your chromosomes. And like I said, 46 homologous pairs of chromosomes and 23 chromosome pairs in all. So, with that said, we can go on to the exchange and how that works. So, I wrote out our three possible phenotypes and genotypes of skin color, which determines whether you're a grounding or a lofty within the novel The Scourge. So here we have our mom, and she has light skin, obviously, because she has two light skin alleles. Then we have our dad. He has dark skin because he has two dark skin alleles. Then we have this hybrid phenotype, which we'll get to later, who has a dark skin allele and a light skin allele. And as I want to stress, these two alleles will determine one single phenotype. And the way I theorized it was that in the exchange, this is how the genetics are working. They're going to be showing incomplete dominance, which means there's not two phenotypes, but there's three phenotypes, because we don't have a dominant or recessive allele. And as you can see, it will result in dark complected when you have two dark skin alleles, tan complected, which is basically my word for what you get in the middle of these two different phenotypes. And then you have light complected, which is what happens when you have two light skin alleles. So as I want to stress again, multiple genes can affect a single phenotype. A phenotype is an appearance of an organism's certain trait. Genotype is the letters used in Punnett squares and represents the possible mixing of alleles to create a specific phenotype. So basically we have your phenotype, which is what we see on the outside. So that would be, phenotype is my brown hair, but my genotype would be probably a big B and a big B for brown hair, because I have 2 brown hair alleles. So with that, we can go to the next slide. This is my first Punnett square, and just to tell you how that works, in that last slide that I showed you, this is your dad with dark skin, because he has a big D and a big D, which are representing our dark skin alleles, and then you have your mom with light skin, and so that's your small d and your small d, because those are representing the light skin alleles. And then when those two mate, basically you have 4 possible outcomes of children, and we determine those with Punnett squares by taking a single allele from each parent and mixing them. So these are our 4 possible outcomes. As you can see, when a dark skin and a light skinned human mate in my theoretical presentation, they will result in 100% hybrid phenotype, which I am using as a tan phenotype, which is basically in the middle of the two. And in the Scourge, you obviously aren't going to be having a grounding and a lofty mate together, so unless you're Fred and Perry. So that means that this was all happening before the society ever split the two up and determined that this is how the exchange is going to work. So that's my theoretical, this is what happened before everything else happened. Then we have our 2 hybrid phenotypes mixing. So a big D and a little d, big D and a little d. So these people are both tan. There's no medium to this tanness. So this one might be a little darker than this one would be. It all just depends on how your genes decide to show. So when you mix 2 hybrid phenotypes together, you will end up with a 25% dark. So this means this one is going to be a for sure dark groundling. Then you will end up with 2 out of 4 or 50% hybrid phenotype, which means these 2 are going to be tan. They can be light tan, dark tan, and however dark they are is going to decide whether they're going to be a groundling or lofty. And then you have a 25% light chance. So that would explain why sometimes 2 groundlings can have a light-skinned baby, because these 2 groundlings are hybrids themselves, or 2 lofties can have a dark-skinned baby, because they're hybrids themselves too. Okay, let me go back really quick. We'll go back to this. So, the difference between homozygous and heterozygous is the fact that this is a homozygous and this is a heterozygous, meaning this one represents one trait while this represents 2 traits. And in this case, it's incomplete dominance, so these 2 traits create a whole nother phenotype, which is tan. Recessive and dominant genes and the possibility of alleles to have an intermediate result, which is our tan. Incomplete dominance that would also be considered dark skin, but lighter than very dark skinned people. So it all just depends on who's controlling the exchange, who's controlling whether they say they look one way or the other, because some tans are just darker than others. And that's why you would have people in your society basically resulting in a lighter darker and a darker darker, but they're still in the same community of groundlings type thing. So that means that in the novel The Scourge, the lofties produce more dark-skinned babies than light-skinned babies because of the presence of incomplete dominance. In the novel Scourge, the Lofties produce more dark-skinned babies than light-skinned babies because of the presence of incomplete dominance. After the virus that strikes the Lofties that kills much of their population, they are already reduced in numbers, which explains some of the number difference between the Lofties and Groundlings, but not all of it. And then the Lofties are then producing mostly dark-skinned children because they are hybrids unaffected by the extra pigment within their skin, but producing children affected by the pigment. So two Lofties create more dark-skinned babies than they would light-skinned babies because of the extra pigment in hybrid phenotypes, and because you're already producing dark-skinned people when you are a hybrid yourself. Let's see. So this tells us that multiple genes are controlling the pigment of skin instead of a single gene, which is basically other words for incomplete dominance. But this Punnett square does not account for the multiple genes controlling pigment and recombinant factors, which is a lot more than I'd like to get into today, so we won't go over that. So due to the complexity of this, my example, like theoretical example for you guys, isn't completely accurate, but it does provide a simplified example for why the populations of the Lofties are dwindling. With that, we will go into lethal viruses and their effect on society. So from the very beginnings of human civilization, there have been remnants of lethal viruses recorded, such as smallpox, measles, and plagues, like the Black Plague. Smallpox was first recorded, like, way back in Egypt times. So lethal viruses have been around since humanity has been around. So the Black Plague, smallpox, and measles spread quickly and caused millions of deaths. Yet this was more due to the lack of physicians' understanding of disease and overall superstition surrounding diseases. So with time, we got a little smarter about how to deal with viruses, and there's obviously less deaths today to these things. If the effect of the virus that causes the Scourge was to be compared to these other diseases, one must come to terms with the fact of the knowledge that viruses has greatly improved. But the spread of viruses in the novel would have to be about 10 times faster than that of any virus observed in history to have the effect that it did on present-day society within the book. Because society basically just totally stopped. There was no way to contain it because this virus must have mutated so fast. So although smallpox, measles, and plagues are really bad, this would have had to be like 10 times worse, and of course going through something such as water that everyone needs and sometimes just can't help themselves. The human tendencies to gather in groups and communities would make diseases, since the beginning of history, spread much faster. And that's basically just a part of our humanity. Everyone wants to be in groups. No one wants to be in solitude all the time. And so this would mean the loss of control of government, who sets many precautions for possible lethal virus epidemics, could only result in if the virus acted on very high percentage of humans and it spread with unimaginable quickness through needed resources such as water, soil, and air. In this book, it was the water, just as explained to work in the novel. So good job, author. That pretty much fits the actual biological standpoint of whether this virus would have happened the way it did. And your explanation of how it happened fits the basic terms of how it could have happened. And the trade is also a big factor when you're dealing with the effect on society, because trade spreads diseases to other communities. So you're already gathered and then you're trading with outside communities, and thus disease keeps spreading. So as you can see with the Loftings and Groundlings, they depend on each other, which makes them their own one society, and they don't cooperate with anyone out of that. So they're basically pushing themselves into solitude, and that's what lethal viruses do. They cause us humans to go against our basic values of gathering and trade and become more of a solitude species type thing. And then I also provided a link, if you guys want to check it out, to the US precautions if a lethal disease was to break out in the States, and you can kind of relate that to whether we are prepared if a lethal virus did come, and just like the Scourge, and whether we would end up living like the grounding Lofties. Then I will talk about biological and chemical warfare. Chemical warfare is most often referred to as a gas and acts quickly and suffocates victims and causes massive burning. So it's your loud type of warfare. It's still scientific, but it's going to act fast, and it's not going to be as silent as biological warfare would be. So the definition for biological warfare is a slower acting thing, and it causes disease to run rampant through a population before the first signs of warfare can be noticed. And so in my theory, the Scourge and the virus that causes the sick ones to be sick ones is through biological warfare going wrong. So in this novel, The Scourge, we can safely assume that the sickness within the Runa was caused by biological warfare that became uncontrollable. Its ability to pass through humans' most needed resources caused it to move much quicker than any real disease ever observed, and still have a lasting impact in Ben's generation because its immovable presence in the water and other people. So, today there have already been instances and worries about the effects of chemical and biological warfare, which was probably a big influence in writing this novel. So just one example of today's biological and chemical warfare is crop dusters were all ordered to not fly on September 11th due to Mohammed Atta hinting his terrorist group had capabilities of placing lethal bacteria or chemicals within the crop duster. So no crop dusters were allowed to fly because they were hinting that they were going to make a chemical attack on the United States. So that is one example of how this type of warfare is already going on in today's society, and how the Scourge is actually, although fantasy, is actually very close to what could happen someday if these were to get out of control. And of course, the antidotes to biological viruses are vaccines that exist for many already known diseases, such as smallpox, and they are stockpiled in case of emergency. But with that comes recent advances in genetic modification of viruses that mean drug-resistant strains could be under development. So all these strains like smallpox, there are antidotes to them, but with today's advances, it would be very easy for terrorists or other countries to get their hands on a genetic modified version of the strain that could only be controlled by them through their own antidotes and not through, let's say, America's antidotes for the original smallpox virus. There is also the threat of biological viruses becoming uncontrollable because they are adapting too quickly to the antidote provided, because biological viruses can also adapt without human help. When they die off, there is always going to be that 0.001% that doesn't die off because they are resistant, and those can replicate, and that makes it so scientists can't keep up with the viruses. So, if the biological virus that was placed in the water of the novel The Scourge was mutated and spread quickly enough, it could result in an infectious virus, much like the one that infects the sick ones. And it could also easily result in the destruction of today's society. So here are my sources, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.